There is a specific hour, arriving in every working life at least once, in which a man discovers that the help he has been waiting for is not coming. Not late, not delayed, not coming at all. I want you to sit with that sentence because I have watched grown men receive this news at 40, at 50, at the very end of a career, and I have watched the receiving of it either destroy them or deliver them, depending entirely on one thing: whether they had at any point before that hour arrived generated a single ounce of forward motion using no engine but their own. I spent 20 years in the company of the wealthiest men this country produced, and I want to report to you a finding that surprised me when I first began cataloging it, though it no longer surprises me at all. Not one of them, not a single documented case across 500 interviews, built his fortune waiting on a current that another man was supposed to supply. Remember this: the push that moves a life forward is manufactured on the inside, or it is never manufactured at all. Consider the cost of not knowing this. There are millions of men and women capable in every measurable sense who have spent decades of productive life in a specific and quiet posture, waiting for the mentor who is supposed to notice them, waiting for the loan officer who is supposed to approve them, waiting for the parent, the partner, the employer, the circumstance to supply the initial motion that will finally set their own effort into visible action. I do not say this to insult them. I say it because the arithmetic of their situation demands an explanation, and the explanation the majority accept, that they are simply unlucky or improperly connected or born a season too early or too late, is, in the overwhelming majority of cases I documented, false. What they lack is not luck. What they lack is not connection. What they lack in every single case is the specific and teachable capacity to generate their own current in advance of any other current arriving to assist them. I want to give you a figure because I have found audiences receive a claim more seriously when it arrives with a number attached rather than a sentiment. Of the 500 men I interviewed across 2 decades, I asked each one directly whether the capital or opportunity that began his fortune had arrived before or after he had already generated visible motion of his own, using only what he possessed at the time. 481 answered that the motion had come first, invariably small, invariably unimpressive by the standards of what eventually followed, and that whatever external assistance arrived afterward had arrived specifically because that motion was already visible to be assisted. The millions who never learn this die waiting. Not literally in every case, though in some cases literally. They die waiting in the sense that matters most to this address. They arrive at the end of a working life having generated no motion of their own, having waited their entire productive years for a push that a great many of them privately and correctly suspected was never coming, and having done nothing about that suspicion except wait harder. I want to be precise about the shape this waiting typically takes because it rarely announces itself honestly. It does not usually look like idleness. The men I am describing are, in the majority of documented cases, occupied constantly, refining a proposal that is never quite finished enough to submit, gathering one further piece of evidence before approaching the person whose approval they require, rehearsing a conversation they have not yet had the occasion to begin. All of this activity produces the sensation of forward movement while producing, in fact, no movement whatsoever, because every hour of it is spent preparing to receive a current rather than generating one. I intend to correct this tonight. Consider the case of Holt Ferrand, foreman of a small wagon fitting shop in Akron, Ohio, in the winter of 1901. Ferrand was 36 years old, married with 2 children, and possessed of a specific and well-founded conviction, a conviction his own employer had privately confirmed to him more than once, that the rubber-treated fittings he had been quietly perfecting on his own time represented a genuine improvement over anything currently sold in that trade. He required capital to leave the wagon works and manufacture the fittings independently. He calculated the sum with some precision, $1,100, a considerable amount for a foreman's household in that era. I want you to understand the specific shape of Ferrand's confidence at this stage because it matters to what follows. He was not a reckless man. He was not given to grand pronouncements about his own destiny. He had tested his fittings against the leading competing product in careful, methodical trials, conducted on his own time across the better part of a year, and had documented the results in a notebook that survives in fragments in his family's records. He had every rational basis for believing the $1,100, once secured, would produce a sound and profitable venture. What he did not yet understand was that the securing of it was not, in fact, the first required step. It only felt that way to him as it feels that way to nearly every man in his position. I want to add a further detail here because it is the detail that separates Ferrand's story from a simple account of persistence rewarded. In the months before he first approached the banker, Ferrand had already been offered twice a modest raise in his foreman's wages if he would agree to remain at the wagon works indefinitely and set aside his private ambitions. He declined both offers, not out of any confidence that his fittings would succeed, but out of a specific and quieter conviction, one his wife later described to their daughter, that a man who accepted comfort in exchange for abandoning a sound idea would spend the comfort wondering for the rest of his life what the idea might have become. This conviction did not by itself generate a single dollar, but it kept him standing in that banker's office a third time rather than accepting the wage increase and closing the matter entirely. And I want you to notice that this, too, was a form of self-generated current, arriving before the more visible current of the $14 and the evening labor that followed it. Ferrand approached the town's principal banker in March of that year. The banker did not refuse him outright. He did something in my documented experience considerably more damaging than an outright refusal. He expressed genuine interest, requested additional documentation, and promised a decision within the month. The month passed. Ferrand returned. The banker apologized, cited unrelated pressures on the bank's own capital, and promised a decision within a further 6 weeks. The 6 weeks passed. Ferrand returned again. He described this second waiting period in a letter to his brother that survives among the family papers as the hardest of the three, because by that point he had begun, quietly, to suspect that the delay was not truly about the bank's capital at all, but about something less easily named, a general hesitation on the banker's part to be the party who moved first on an unproven venture, regardless of how sound the underlying figures appeared on paper. I want to leave Ferrand standing in that banker's outer office for the third time, hat in hand, in the summer of 1901, because what he did next, and what he did not do, is the entire content of the law I am about to hand you, and I do not want to rob you of the mechanism by rushing past the moment it was actually decided. Here is the mechanism, and I ask you to receive it as a law rather than as an encouragement, because encouragement fades and a law does not. A man waiting on another man's current has made an unspoken agreement with his own future, and the agreement reads as follows: I will begin moving the moment someone else supplies the force to move me. This agreement feels to the man who has made it like patience. It feels like prudence. It does not feel from the inside like what it actually is, which is the complete and voluntary surrender of one's own ignition to a party who was never obligated to supply it in the first place. Think of the matter as an engineer thinks of it. A machine requires a current to operate. That current may arrive from an external source, a generator, a battery, a line run in from elsewhere, or it may be produced internally by the machine's own mechanism, independent of any outside supply. A machine wired only to receive an external current and possessing no capacity to generate its own is a machine entirely at the mercy of whoever controls the switch on the other end of that line. It does not matter how well built the machine is. It does not matter how urgently the machine is needed. If the switch is never thrown, the machine does not move, regardless of its own considerable capacity to have moved. This is precisely the condition of the man waiting for his mentor, his banker, his lucky break. He has built himself, however capably, as a machine wired only for external current, and he has placed the switch in the hands of a party who owes him nothing and who is, in nearly every documented case, occupied with switches of considerably greater urgency to himself than the one controlling this particular man's future. I want to add one further dimension to this mechanism, because I have found it is the part that explains why capable men fail to notice their own condition until the hour I described at the opening of this address. The man wired only for external current does not experience himself as motionless. He experiences himself as busy. He is drafting letters, attending meetings, refining his proposal, gathering additional documentation the banker has requested. All of this activity feels, and in a narrow sense is, genuine effort. But it is effort directed entirely at persuading the external current to arrive, rather than effort directed at generating motion independent of it. And a machine can exhaust itself entirely in the act of asking for a current without ever once producing a single revolution of its own gears. There is a further consequence of this condition worth naming precisely, because it compounds over time in a way the man experiencing it rarely perceives until considerable damage has accumulated. Each month spent persuading rather than producing trains the mind toward persuasion as its primary instrument, and away from production as a skill requiring its own daily practice. A man who has spent a year refining his pitch to a banker has become, at the end of that year, measurably more skilled at pitching and measurably no more skilled at the actual trade his venture depends upon. Ferrand, by contrast, spent his 11 months of independent production becoming a better manufacturer of fittings with every batch, an improvement no amount of persuading the original banker could ever have produced in him. The law is this. The current that moves a man's life forward must at some point be self-generated, or the man does not move, regardless of talent, regardless of readiness, regardless of how justly he is owed the help he continues month after month to wait for. Now consider the contrasting case, because a law is never fully visible until you have watched a capable man violate it and pay the documented price. I knew a man named Bertram Ashworth, a machinist in a manufacturing town not 40 miles from where Ferrand worked, in the very same period. Ashworth was, by the account of every colleague I interviewed regarding him, the more naturally gifted of the two men, quicker with a lathe, more inventive in his private hours, possessed of an idea for an improved coupling mechanism that several engineers who examined it later described as genuinely superior to Ferrand's fittings in its underlying principle. Ashworth also required capital. Ashworth also approached a banker. And Ashworth, unlike Ferrand, received from that banker not a delay, but a specific and genuine promise, a verbal commitment made in good faith that funding would be arranged within the year, once a pending transaction elsewhere in the bank's affairs had concluded. Here is precisely where Ashworth failed, and I want you to notice that his failure was not a failure of talent, nor a failure of the idea itself, both of which were sound. Ashworth believed the promise. He believed it so completely that he ceased entirely his own private efforts to generate capital by any other means. He did not seek a second source. He did not reduce his design to a smaller and more affordable first version he might have funded from his own modest savings. He did not approach the two other men in his own trade who might have formed a partnership. He waited in good conscience for the current he had been promised, because the promise had been sincerely made, and he saw no reason to doubt it. I want to be fair to Ashworth here, because I think it is the fairness that makes his case instructive rather than simply cautionary. He was not a foolish man. The promise he received was, by every account, made in genuine good faith by a banker who fully intended to honor it. Ashworth's error was not credulity. It was the specific decision, reasonable sounding in the moment, that a genuine promise from a credible party relieved him of the obligation to continue generating his own current in the meantime. This is precisely the decision the law forbids, and it is precisely the decision that feels, to the man making it, like the sensible one. I want to give you a specific detail from Ashworth's own correspondence, preserved among his effects and shown to me by a nephew who had inherited them, because it captures the particular quality of his waiting with more precision than any summary of mine could manage. In a letter written to a cousin some 8 months into the delay, Ashworth wrote that he did not wish to appear impatient or ungrateful toward a banker who had, after all, given him his word, and that a man of honor ought to extend to another man of apparent honor the same patience he would wish extended to himself. There is nothing dishonorable in that sentiment, examined on its own terms. What it concealed, from Ashworth himself as much as from anyone else, was that patience extended toward another man's promise had become, without his noticing the substitution, a replacement for the production he might otherwise have continued generating on his own account, regardless of what that promise eventually produced. The transaction the banker was waiting on did not conclude within the year. It did not conclude within 2 years. By the 3rd year, the banker's own institution had been absorbed into a larger concern during a regional financial contraction. The original promise dissolved along with the officer who had made it, and Ashworth's coupling design, examined years later by a historian of the trade, was found substantially reproduced independently by all available evidence in a patent filed by a different manufacturer entirely, a manufacturer who had simply continued generating his own current the entire time Ashworth had been waiting for someone else to generate it for him. Ashworth died, according to the trade records I was able to locate, still employed as a machinist at a wage not substantially different from what he had earned the year he first approached that banker. He had waited in total, across the remainder of his working life, for a current he privately continued to believe until nearly the end would eventually arrive. I want you to ask yourself something now, and I want the honesty of the answer to matter more to you than the comfort of it. Where, in your own present circumstances, have you quietly made Ashworth's agreement, the agreement that says you will begin moving the moment someone else supplies the current? Sit with that question before you continue, because the fear operating beneath it in the majority of cases I documented is not the fear most people would name if asked directly. It is not simply the fear of poverty, though poverty is often the eventual result. It is the fear of criticism, specifically the fear of moving forward on one's own sole authority without another party's confirmation attached to the decision, so that if the effort fails, the failure belongs entirely and undividedly to the man who made it. This is worth stating plainly because it explains why intelligent men make Ashworth's error rather than Ferrand's correction. Waiting for another man's current is, underneath its surface appearance of patience, frequently an act of self-protection. If the banker never funds you, the failure to begin is his. If you generate your own current and the effort fails regardless, the failure is entirely, unambiguously, undeniably your own, and there is no comfortable way to distribute that particular weight to any other party. I have found this fear operates most powerfully in precisely the men most capable of succeeding without external assistance, which is the specific cruelty of it. The man of genuine ability has more, not less, to protect by avoiding the exposure of acting entirely on his own authority, because a failure attributable solely to himself would contradict the very self-image his ability has built for him. The mediocre man risks little by waiting, because little was expected of him regardless. The capable man, waiting, is protecting something considerably more valuable to him, the undisturbed belief that his ability would have succeeded had circumstances only cooperated. And this protected belief, comfortable as it is, has never once, in any case I documented, produced a fortune. I want to name the specific mechanism by which this fear disguises itself, because a disguised fear is considerably harder to correct than an acknowledged one. The capable man does not tell himself he is afraid of sole responsibility. He tells himself he is being prudent, that a wise man does not act without proper backing, that patience is a virtue rather than a liability. Every one of these statements can be true in a general sense. What makes them in this specific application a disguise rather than genuine wisdom is that they are deployed selectively, invoked precisely at the moment independent action is required, and never once invoked to explain why the waiting itself has continued for months or years, beyond any reasonable estimate of how long a genuine external process ought to take. I ask you to notice this fear operating in yourself honestly, because a fear correctly named loses a portion of its authority the moment it is named. I want to pause before handing you the principle itself on one further point that I have found essential to the men who successfully applied it. The recognition of this fear is not by itself sufficient to dissolve it. A man may name his fear of sole responsibility with complete accuracy and continue waiting regardless, because naming a fear removes only a portion of its authority, not the whole of it. What removes the remainder is the specific act the formula I am about to give you requires, the act of generating motion small enough that the sole responsibility attached to it feels correctly survivable. A man does not need to feel entirely unafraid before he begins. He needs only to have reduced the objective to a size where the fear, however present, no longer commands the outcome. Here, then, is the principle handed over plainly, in language exact enough that a child could repeat it back to you. You must push yourself because no other man's obligation to push you has ever existed, regardless of what has been promised, and regardless of how justly you believe yourself owed the assistance. Remember this: a promise of future help is not help. It is, until the day it is actually delivered, nothing more than a pleasant sound occupying the space where your own action was supposed to occur. Ferrand understood this eventually, standing in that banker's outer office for the third time. Ashworth never understood it at all, and the difference between the two men in every measurable outcome that followed was not talent and was not the soundness of the idea. It was the presence in one case and the absence in the other of a self-generated current. I want you to sit with the precise weight of that sentence before I move on, because I have found that audiences hear it, nod at it, and then proceed to underestimate exactly how completely it applies to their own circumstance. It does not apply only to the man seeking $1,100 from a banker. It applies with identical force to the woman waiting for a superior to notice work she has not yet made visible, to the young man waiting for a father's approval before committing to a trade he has already privately chosen, to the widow waiting for a grown child to suggest the business partnership she has been capable of proposing herself for a decade. The particulars change. The law beneath the particulars does not. I want to state the principle once more in its shortest possible form, because a law worth carrying out of this room is a law short enough to be carried. No current arrives before you generate one of your own, not the banker's, not the mentor's, not the fortunate introduction you have been assured by someone who meant it sincerely is only a matter of time. Every external current that has ever moved a man's fortune forward arrived after his own current was already, however modestly, in motion. I will now give you the formula by which this current is deliberately generated, and I ask that you follow it exactly, because I have watched men attempt an approximate version of it and produce results indistinguishable from having attempted nothing at all. First, identify with complete honesty the specific external current you are presently waiting to receive. Name it precisely: the promotion, the investor, the permission, the introduction, because a vague waiting cannot be corrected, and only a precisely named waiting can be. Most men, when I have asked them this question directly, discover they have never once stated the waited-for thing in exact terms, and the vagueness of the waiting is itself part of what has allowed it to continue undisturbed for so long. Second, reduce your objective to the smallest version of itself that requires no external current whatsoever to begin. Ferrand, after his third disappointment, did not wait for $1,100. He began producing a limited quantity of his fittings by hand in the evenings, using tools already in his possession, funded by a sum small enough that he supplied it from his own household savings, without requesting permission from any party. Third, begin this smaller version within the week, not within the season. The specific danger of delay is not merely lost time. It is the slow conversion of a temporary postponement into a permanent identity. The man who was going to begin becomes gradually, and without any single dramatic moment marking the change, the man who talks about having once intended to begin. I have interviewed a great many men in this second category, and every one of them could name with perfect clarity the external current he was still in some quiet corner of his thinking waiting for, decades after the waiting had ceased to make any practical sense at all. Fourth, treat every external current that does eventually arrive, the loan, the mentor, the fortunate introduction, as an acceleration of motion already in progress, never as the ignition of motion that has not yet started. A current added to an already moving machine multiplies its output. A current promised to a stationary machine simply extends indefinitely the stationary condition, because the machine has demonstrated by its own stillness that it requires the current before it will move at all. And this is precisely the demonstration no lender, no mentor, no partner wishes to observe in the party he is being asked to assist. Fifth, Maintain a written record of the motion you generate independently, however small, and review it weekly. This record serves two purposes I have found essential. It provides evidence to yourself that self-generated motion is genuinely occurring, which the mind requires in order to sustain the effort. And it provides evidence to any external party who later considers supplying additional current that you are precisely the kind of man who does not require them in order to move, which is, without exception, the exact quality that causes such parties to finally decide to move on your behalf. I want to close this formula with an observation about the relationship between its 5 steps, because they are not 5 independent instructions so much as a single instruction viewed from 5 angles. Every one of them exists to correct the same original error, the belief that the first required action belongs to someone other than yourself. Naming the current you await, reducing the objective, beginning within the week, treating later assistance as acceleration rather than ignition, and recording your own motion are 5 different methods of installing in a mind that has grown accustomed to waiting the specific and durable conviction that it was never actually waiting on anyone but itself. I anticipate several objections, and I intend to answer each one directly rather than permit it to remain unexamined in your mind. The first objection, that some objectives, by their genuine nature, require a sum of capital or a degree of assistance that cannot be reduced to any smaller version a man might generate alone. I answer this with the evidence rather than with reassurance. In 500 documented cases, I did not find a single genuine exception to the principle of reduction, though I found a great many men who believed, sincerely and incorrectly, that their own case was the exception. Ferrand's $1,100 objective was reduced to a version fundable with $14 of household savings. The reduction is nearly always available. What is nearly always absent is the willingness to accept a smaller and less impressive first version of the objective in place of the complete version the man had been picturing. I want to address directly the specific form this objection most often takes, because I have heard it stated almost word for word by men in dozens of different trades. A man will tell me that his particular venture requires a factory, or a fleet of vehicles, or a license that cannot be obtained without capital he does not possess, and that no smaller version of a factory, a fleet, or a license exists. I do not dispute that a smaller factory, in the literal sense, may be impossible. What I dispute is that the factory is, in fact, the first required step. In every documented case where I traced the matter to its origin, the man's actual first requirement was not the factory itself, but evidence. Evidence, generated independently and inexpensively, that the product the factory would eventually produce was wanted at the price he proposed to sell it. That evidence has never, in a single case I examined, required a factory to generate. It has required at most a single sample, produced by hand, and the willingness to walk it door to door until someone agreed to purchase it. The second objection, that generating one's own current, while the correct principle in theory, risks producing an inferior or diminished result compared to the version that proper external funding would have made possible. I answer this plainly. A diminished version in motion will, in every documented case I examined, outperform a complete version standing still, because the diminished version is capable of the single act the complete version is not. It can improve itself through its own operation, gathering evidence, correcting its own errors, and generating the exact record of independent capability that eventually attracts the larger current the man originally sought. The complete version, standing still, awaiting its current, improves nothing and demonstrates nothing except its own continued stillness. The third objection, and I regard this one as the most serious, that some men, through genuine and specific misfortune, find themselves with no smaller version available to them at all. No household savings, no evening hours free, no tools already in their possession. I want to answer this one with precision rather than dismissal, because I do not wish to insult a genuine hardship by pretending it does not exist. What I have found in the cases of most severe documented hardship is that the reduction available to such a man is not smaller in scale, but different in kind. Not a reduced version of the original objective, but a specific act of self-education, self-organization, or relationship building conducted during whatever margin of time and effort remains to him, that generates no immediate income but produces the identical internal current the formula requires. The reduction changes its shape according to a man's circumstances. It does not, in a single documented case I examine closely enough to be certain of the facts, disappear entirely. The fourth objection, that a man who generates his own current and succeeds through it might reasonably ask why he required the address at all, since he evidently possessed the capacity within him the entire time. I answer this one directly because it deserves a direct answer. He possessed the capacity. He did not possess, before this address, the clear understanding that the capacity was required of him specifically and would not arrive from any other source. Capacity unrecognized as necessary is capacity that remains in the overwhelming majority of documented cases unused. A man may own a generator for years without once operating it if he has spent those years believing in good faith that the current would arrive by some other wire entirely. I return you now to Holt Ferrand, standing in that banker's outer office for the third time, hat in hand, in the summer of 1901. He did not return a fourth time. He did something else instead, and I want to give you the account exactly as it was given to me decades later by his own daughter, who had by then inherited the business built from what her father did next. Ferrand went home that evening and calculated with his wife the smallest possible batch of fittings he could produce using tools already in his shed and materials he could afford from that week's wages. The figure came to $14. He produced 11 fittings over the following 3 weekends, sold 9 of them directly to wagon repair shops in the surrounding towns at a modest markup, and used the proceeds to fund a second and slightly larger batch the following month. His daughter recalled, from stories told at the family table across her own childhood, that her father never described this period as dramatic or difficult in the retelling, though the ledger from those months, which she still possessed, showed evenings that ran past midnight and Sundays given over entirely to the work. What she remembered most clearly was a specific habit he maintained throughout. Every Friday evening, regardless of how the week's sales had gone, he sat down and wrote in a small notebook exactly what he had produced and sold that week, and exactly what he intended to produce the following one. It was, she said, the only part of the entire venture he described to her as something he had done on purpose, rather than something that had simply happened to him. She told me one further detail I have carried with me since, because I believe it captures the entire law more precisely than any formal statement of it could manage. She asked her father once, as a young girl, whether he had been frightened during those 11 months, not knowing whether the banker would ever return his $1,100, or whether the whole venture might fail before it had properly begun. He told her he had not thought about the banker at all during most of that period. He had been too occupied, he said, with the actual work of making and selling the fittings to spend much time wondering about a decision that belonged to someone else entirely. The fear, she recalled him saying, had lived almost exclusively in the months of waiting. Once he began generating his own current, there had simply been too little remaining attention to spare for it. He did not return to the banker's office for 11 months. When he finally did return, he did not come as a man requesting $1,100 to begin a venture. He came as a man requesting $400 to expand a venture already 11 months in profitable operation, with a written ledger, a growing client list, and a demonstrated capacity to generate his own motion entirely independent of anything the bank had or had not supplied him. The loan was approved within the week. Holt Ferrand's rubber-treated fittings company operated under his family's ownership for the following 43 years. I told you at the opening of this address that there is a specific hour in which a man discovers the help he has been waiting for is not coming. I want you to understand now precisely what that hour actually offers a man beneath its disguise as bad news. It offers him the exact moment his own current was always required to begin. Not permission to despair, instruction to begin. I want to leave you with one final observation before I give you tonight's instruction, because I believe it is the observation that will determine whether you act on what has been said here or simply agree with it and continue exactly as before. The hour I have described does not arrive with any particular drama. It rarely announces itself as the decisive moment it actually is. For Ferrand, it arrived as a third disappointing conversation in a banker's outer office, indistinguishable on its surface from the two disappointments that preceded it. What made it decisive was not the hour itself, but what Ferrand did in the days immediately following it. And I want you to understand that whatever hour of this kind you have already lived through in your own working life may still be corrected tonight, regardless of how much time has passed since it quietly came and went unrecognized. Here is what I am asking you to do before you sleep tonight, and I ask it exactly, without softening any portion of it. Take a single sheet of paper. Name in writing the specific external current you have been waiting to receive. Beneath it, write the smallest possible version of your objective that requires no such current at all, a version fundable, reachable, or beginnable, using only what is already in your own possession tonight. Begin that smaller version within the week. The millions who hear an address of this kind will do nothing with it, precisely as they have done nothing with every prior indication that the current they were waiting for was never coming. I extend to you directly the invitation not to be counted among them. The law has been named. The formula has been handed to you exactly. The current is yours to generate. It has always been yours to generate. No one else was ever going to generate it for you.